Hello and welcome to What Did I Learn, an 8-part series of short podcasts considering Chapter 11 from the book Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time by Professor Carl Quigley. My learning was prompted through membership of the Telegram-based CTTM, Cutting Through the Matrix book club. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim. Nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank, owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. Carl Quigley. Tragedy and Hope, Chapter 11, Changing Economic Patterns, page 546. The Results of Economic Depression. Quigley opens this section by noting that the deflationary gap arising from a failure of investment to reach the level of savings can be closed either by lowering the supply of goods to the level of the available purchasing power, or by raising the supply of purchasing power to a level able to absorb the existing supply of goods, or by a combination of both. The first option would enable a stabilized economy with a low level of economic activity, while the second option would enable a stabilized economy with a higher level of economic activity. Left to its own devices, a modern economic system would adopt the former, albeit negative, operational mode, that is, falling prices, declining economic activity, and as a consequence, rising unemployment would manifest. And the outcome? A fall in national income and a likely rapid decline in the volume of savings. Quigley notes that the level of decline will continue until the volume of savings reaches the level of investment, at which point matters will stabilize within the economy, but at a lower level. There can be little doubt that under such conditions, that is, prolonged economic decline, the masses within the population would have been driven to revolution. So wise governments took steps to correct matters before any off-with-their-heads moment arrived. Quigley reveals the two methods utilized to deal with depressions as A, those which destroy goods, or B, those which produce goods which do not enter the market. Approach A will close the deflationary gap by reducing the supply of goods to the level of supply of purchasing power. This, of course, is actually par for the course within the normal business cycle. Quigley notes that a failure to utilize the economic system at the 1929 level in the years 1930 through 34 represented a loss of goods worth $100 billion in the US, Britain, and Germany alone. In agricultural context, for example, a destruction of goods would be a failure to gather the harvest in, for example, fruits, berries, vegetables, etc. When a farmer leaves his crop of oranges, peaches, or strawberries unharvested because the selling price is too low to cover the expense of harvesting, he is in effect destroying the goods. Typically, Quigley notes, is the fact that complete destruction of goods as a means of combating depression was not heretofore typically engaged in, but was introduced for the first time in the period 1930 to 34. Goodness me, what a wanton waste. Between 1930 and 34, stores of coffee, sugar and bananas were destroyed, corn was ploughed under, and young livestock were slaughtered to reduce supply on the market. Quigley notes that warfare was yet another facilitator of goods destruction, and a so-called tactic against deflationary conditions. Stockpiling seems to be another method which Quigley outlines. This accomplishes its purpose by providing purchasing power in the market, that is, the cost of the production of such goods does enter the market as purchasing power, but the goods themselves do not drain funds from the system if they are not offered for sale. Seems obvious, but Quigley states it anyway. That is, there is a growing reluctance to invest during depressive cycles, therefore no purchasing power will be provided from a constant stream of private investment, which would likely lead to prosperity. And so, in such circumstance as the aforementioned, funds for producing goods which do not enter the market must be sought via programs of government spending. However, unfortunately, this will lead to inflation and to public debt. Quigley notes that the methods of paying for a depression are exactly the same as paying for a war, except the combination of methods used may be different because the goals are different. In financing war, Quigley notes we should seek to achieve a method which will produce a maximum output with a minimum inflation and public debt. On the other hand, in dealing with a depression, that is, in seeking to close a deflationary gap, the goal will be to provide maximum output with a necessary degree of inflation and a minimum public debt, where the use of fiat money being more justifiable in financing through a depression than financing through a war. Quigley next turns to bonds and states the selling of bonds to private persons in wartime may well be aimed at the lower income groups so as to reduce consumption and to release facilities for war production. However, in a depression, with low consumption being the main problem, the sale of bonds to finance public spending would need to be aimed at the savings of upper income groups. So, how would one summarize such methodologies? Well, Quigley notes the ideas relative to the role of government in such varying circumstance can be characterized as the theory of compensatory economy. In one circumstance, deflationary, the government needs to work against the business cycle, that is, by lowering taxes, larger spending, while in the other, a boom period, the government needs to raise taxes and to reduce spending. Quigley notes that this, what he calls compensatory economy, has not been successful in any European country except Sweden. Interesting to note, for me anyway, at this point is that Sweden had primarily left-leaning governments for very many years. In a democratic country context, it would take control of tax and spend away from elected representatives and place this precious power of the purse into the automatic process of business cycle, as interpreted by so-called bureaucratic experts. Well, isn't this precisely where we're headed today, what with the overt drive into technocracy and its enabling infotech incorporating so-called AI? Quigley notes that programs of deficit spending would likely be in jeopardy in nations with private banking systems. After all, in such circumstance, the creation of money or credit is typically reserved for the private banks and is depreciated via government action. Here, in my humble opinion, is a pretty important message. Quigley states the argument that the creation of money by the government is bad, while the creation of funds by banks is good, can be very persuasive in any system based upon traditional laissez-faire, and in which the usual avenues of communication, newspapers, radio, etc., are under private or even banking control. Public spending to counter depression can vary significantly. For example, spending for the destruction of goods or for a restriction of output, such as was the case with the New Deal agricultural program, can't easily be justified in democratic context, because it results in a decline in national income, and as such also a decline in living standards. Spending for investment in productive equipment is good, since such will lead to an increase in national wealth and an increase in standards of living. However, in reality, it moves the economy away from private capitalism and can easily be undermined in a country with a capitalist ideology and with private banking. Very interesting to note is the next statement from Quigley, that is, spending on armaments and national defence is the last method of fighting depression, and was the one most readily and most widely adopted in 20th century Europe. Hitler's Germany, anyone? Public expenditure on armaments, Quigley notes, is a method of filling the deflationary gap and overcoming depression because it adds purchasing power to the market without drawing such back out again at a later stage. That is, armaments produced are not put up for sale. The aforementioned method of combating depression is not much different from what we looked at earlier, that is, destruction of goods, because in this case economic resources are diverted from constructive activities or idleness to production for the purpose of destruction. What a sick concept. So what then could the justification be for the adoption of the method just described? Well, apart from political or other grounds, like for example assisting heavy industry directly and immediately through a rearmament program, there could be no other justification. Quigley notes that heavy industry is the segment of the economy which suffers earliest and most in any depression, which absorbs manpower readily, that is, reduces unemployment, and which falls under political influence in most countries. National defence, of course, is the justification card played to the public relative to spending on rearmament, especially if other countries are dealing with economic crises in the same manner. Quigley suggests that the adoption of rearmament as a method of dealing with depression needs to be conscious. Adopting countries may feel it is the correct course to follow, perhaps on foot of a feeling of being threatened by aggression, and that rearmament is necessary for political protection. It is rare, Quigley suggests, for any country to consciously adopt a program of aggression, because in most wars, both sides are convinced that their actions are defensive, and it is equally rare for countries to adopt a program of rearmament as any solution to depression. However, in the face of danger from a neighbour, and in a country suffering with a depression, it can be tempting to engage in rearmament as a possible economic solution, such being less likely, though, in any country experiencing economic boom conditions. Fascism, Quigley points out, is the adoption by vested interests in society of an authoritarian form of government in order to maintain vested interests, that is, the status quo. At last, Quigley arrives at a point at which, without actually mentioning Germany, and indeed Tiny Moustache Man, he gets as close as makes no difference to a mention by recording as follows. In the 20th century in Europe, vested interests usually sought to prevent reform of economic systems, a reform necessary by long depression, by adopting an economic program whose chief element was an attempt to fill the deflationary gap via rearmament. And there's more, much more. Why not check out the Alan Watt CTTM channel on YouTube, where Melissa regularly presents redux material from the late great Alan Watt, and in addition presents her own ever-interesting real history programs. In addition, also on YouTube, you have the very excellent Hayes Reviews channel, where you can enjoy full online readings and genial host interactions relative to a huge range of truly significant books. Books which reveal truth relative to history from the very pens of movers and shakers of bygone eras. They may be gone, but to this day we are living a dark legacy of their anti-human plans and schemes, which are being actualized by their intergenerational ideological devotees and collaborators. I hope you have found the information which was presented here to have been both interesting and indeed educational. Thank you for your time and attention, and please do check out the other 7 podcasts in this mini-series.